Okay, so Grant, come on up. Yeah, Grant. So again, we focus on topics that are directly applicable. And again, to this question as to why open source? Todd, you keep talking about open source. I've personally been involved and sort of on this push for 12 years strong, so for more than a decade. But Grant is a great example, as you could tell by the title of his talk, from contributor, open source contributor to co-founder. And Grant's one of the leading experts in the world when it comes to search. And Grant might not ever tell you that, but I would tell you that without hesitation. So anyone in this room that's worked on the search side has probably heard of Lucidworks and has more than likely heard of Grant Ingersoll. So, however, Grant's talk today, I think, on the Keynote side, is more of about his own personal experience from contributing to open source. Yeah, open source contributor, actually to co-founder of one of the more successful technology companies in the United States. So Grant, come on up.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, man. Oops. Good morning. I want you to flash back with me to 2004. I got hired at Syracuse University's Center for Natural Language Processing, basically a research institution geared around helping computers understand what we as humans do. My boss at the time said, "Hey Grant, welcome aboard. We use this project called Apache Lucene. Go learn it." Little did I know, those 7 words have absolutely changed my life. Interestingly enough, when I started giving away my code, I actually doubled my income. Kind of an interesting story. Lucene, if you don't know, powers pretty much every search engine on the planet other than the internet search. So if you've ever used Reddit or Home Depot or REI or Lowe's or a whole host of other sites, Yelp, etc., you have used Lucene. And if you ever really want to understand how any of those engines work, I encourage you to go look at Lucene. And Lucene actually has a really fascinating open source history in that the guy who created it, Doug Cutting, who some of you may have heard of from the Hadoop world, wrote Lucene as a side project in 1999 as a way to teach himself Java. Think about what your first Java program was for those who've written Java. If you think about the impact this project has had on the world, it's quite amazing, and the personal impact is outstanding for me as well. So of course I dug in on Lucene. Flash forward a couple more years, 2006, CNET came out with a project built on top of Lucene called Solr. Actually stood at the time for search on Lucene with Resin. Resin was an old web container, if you remember those days. These days, we just call it Solr. Cool thing about Solr is all the things that you had to program in Lucene, now you can just configure. If you've ever used Elasticsearch, much the same idea. Let's take this core engine, let's add scaling, let's add all this other stuff that most likely goes into building a search engine, things like type ahead and faceting and aggregations and statistics and all of that. The really cool thing about Solr for me is now all of a sudden I didn't have to maintain all of that code that I had written at my prior job. Interestingly enough though, one of the things about getting involved in open source is people start to come to you and say, "Hey, could you help me with this?" And what often starts out as helping them on the mailing list turns into the, "Hey, could I pay you to help me on this? I really need your time," right? This was happening more and more, and so turns out it was actually happening to a bunch of us, the other committers on these projects. And so we got together in 2007, 2 other committers as well as a user of Solr and Lucene, and said, "Why don't we form a company around this?" At the time, we called it Lucid Imagination. Don't ask me why. It wasn't my choice. Long name, a lot of weird meaning to it, but it worked at the time. And so the company was born. In those early days, we really focused in on building out around consulting and around support services. We bootstrapped our very first year and then raised $6 million out of some venture firms in the Valley in 2008. If anybody remembers 2008, it was not exactly a fun time to raise money, but it was a good time to raise money if you were an open source company, right? Because you were a value proposition at the time. You were disrupting the really expensive offerings out there, right? So this talk then is really about some of the key lessons I've learned in running an open source company, right? And we'll talk about some of the trade-offs and all of that. And just as we go forward, know that there's more than one way to run an open source company. And so your mileage may vary. The first thing I really learned is, of course, open source is a lot of great things. Don't worry, there will be some words here soon. It's a licensing model, it's a distribution model, it's a way of building community. It's a great way as an individual to build out a brand for yourself. It's not a business model. By definition, open source is free. Now, of course, there's lots of things you can go and do around open source to make money. And in fact, those early years, we got paid to contribute back to the open source project. We did support. We did a whole lot of consulting. And we even tried to build a product that was very closely tied to this Apache project called Solr. The reality is, none of those really worked. Consulting's great when you're an individual or a small team, but as a venture-backed firm, you're not going to get the multiples that a venture company wants out of doing open source consulting. Support can also be a great model. Red Hat, I think, which we modeled ourselves off of early on, is a great example of selling support. The reality, though, for a lot of open source companies is when it comes to that support model, what they're really doing is selling you support based off of the fact that the open source is just good enough. And what you often then find is that your customers are coming to you with what I like to call pre-existing conditions. In other words, their hair is on fire, please help me, and you're trying to jam down their throats a one-year support contract. They buy it, you get them happy in 2 months, 1 month, a couple weeks. You put out the fire, year comes up, hey guys, see you later. In fact, my CEO often says, our customers used to give us the nicest cancellation letters. You guys are great. We're up, we're happy, we don't need you anymore. Power of open source, of course, but not exactly a great business model. So for us, what then evolved over all those years of doing consulting and support is we realized a lot of people were asking us how to do more interesting things. The reality is for Solr, it pretty much just works. And so there's not much of a support business there. It's kind of like the old Maytag repairman, if you will. And so we had to think of something different. And so for us, that was a commercial product. I like to say it complements and extends the open source. It does a lot of different things that single project of Solr or Lucene doesn't do. But at the end of the day, we had to build a commercial product. So then the question that often arises as soon as you start doing and building a commercial product is, what do you contribute back to open source? And in fact, early days of our business, we hired a lot of committers and contributors to the open source with the promise of, you get to work on open source all day. But again, that doesn't always pay the bills, right? At the end of the day, especially as a startup, you need to make money. It's a different story when you're the big company that is, especially a service, and you're just engaging with that service and contributing to open source. But for us, we had to figure out a model that allowed us to do that. And so we had to figure out, what are we going to keep and what are we going to contribute? This actually took us quite some time, and we had a lot of discussions internally. And our users asked us a lot of questions about, hey, could you contribute that? Or why aren't you contributing that? Or, gee, can I just pay you to contribute this thing that's your feature back to the open source? It's like, huh, wait. And so around and around we went, and kind of where we've ended up these days, and it may or may not work for you, is because we build a data product, the question we always ask ourselves is, does this thing that we're trying to build need to be close to the storage and the indexing layer, the core technology? How do we better enhance the scalability of how we process data? How do we enable us to ask better questions of the data? If the answer is yes, we need it to be close to those layers, it goes back into the open source. If it's all about how we engage with that product, the actual questions we're asking or any of the scaffolding around of it, that tends to be stuff we keep for ourselves or open source in other ways. So it's about 2012, 2013. All's going really well. Company's growing, raised more money, all of that good stuff. And then we got hit by an absolute train. Some of you who know this space may have heard of a company called Elasticsearch, or Elastic these days, they just went public. They came in with a new model. They really went after a new brand of developer. We tended to be very focused on really hardcore, what I call search nerds. And I get to say that because I'm a search nerd. Whereas they said, hey, we're going to go after the Mongo developers, the Cassandra developers, the people who are building really rapid applications, right? And so things got really interesting for us. And in fact, it was really interesting in the sense that most times traditionally when there's a company that is disrupting bigger players, it's the bigger players who come and try to squash you, right? It's the Oracles and the Microsofts and the IBMs and all of those who are trying to put out this new and upstart company once you've kind of reached that stage of viability. For us, we actually got disrupted, or at least partially disrupted, by another open source project. That's not all that common, right? But one of the interesting things in dealing with the Elastic issue for us at the company was it really forced us to ask some really hard questions internally. And this has really got nothing to do with open source so much as it just does with business, is how do you deal with competition? If you recall at the start, I said, perhaps, or I think I said, we wanted to be the red hat for search. The reality is if you're the X for Y of anything, if you're the red hat for databases or the red hat for whatever, you're probably not quite thinking about it right. Because what you really need to do is figure out what you are, right? And Elastic forced us to do that. And along the way, a couple of interesting things happened. One, we had to go figure out what was the appeal of Elastic. Primarily, it was geared around ease of use, ease of getting started especially, maybe not ease of production, but ease of getting started, as well as some of their early scaling and integration with AWS. And so we had to really dig in on how do we deal with those kinds of issues, and really then answer what is Lucidworks going to be all about. Interestingly enough, while we had doubled down and invested even more in Solr as a company, and we tried to at least mitigate the ease of use and the scaling questions, such that these days I feel, and obviously I'm super biased here, that the two open source projects are on par in terms of features and capabilities. We have some things they don't have, they have some things we don't have, we scale, they scale, all of these good things. We had to figure out what then would differentiate us. Interestingly enough, another open source project kind of came to the rescue, if you will. One of the cool things that happened with Elastic is they actually broadened people's understanding of search. And in fact, they made the market way bigger. And of course, because we were in that market, we could take advantage of that. We didn't have to go out and educate developers about what search was and why we believe search is to next generation applications what databases, traditional SQL relational databases, were to the previous generation of applications. Because search has this ability to say what is important in data, you can then build out way smarter and richer applications than I believe you can ever do with databases. So along comes the Spark project. If you're not familiar with Spark, it's basically large-scale distributed computing. We then as a company said, well, gee, we need large-scale distributed computing. We have this database called Solr, which is basically where we ask the question, what do I know about my data right now? We then said, we want to do all this really smart AI stuff, machine learning, et cetera. Well, guess what? We need large-scale distributed computing for that. So interestingly enough, I think one of the emerging open source business models these days really is, how do we combine together multiple projects to make for a better application? And in many ways, this move for us has really changed the game. For one, it helped us differentiate from just the core project that we were contributing to, right? Just Solr. There was no longer this question around donations anymore, right? Because which project do we donate to? Some things are all about tying these things together. They don't belong in one project or the other, right? It's about the integration of them. We could then build out and around them. It actually also gave us some really key differentiators against Elastic. It also allowed us to do and ask more interesting questions of our data. Because one of our key things that we do, and one of the things that really powers internet-level search these days, is how do you combine your content with user behavior to then churn that into deeper insights that then power your application? You hear all the buzzwords about AI. That's all AI really is. Data combined with user behavior to try to predict future behavior. It's not anything special. Don't believe the hype. These days, it's become really interesting for me in that my early idealism around open source has kind of evolved into a bit of pragmatism, for better or for worse. I think anybody who matures in a community goes through this process of being super excited, and then you kind of just realize life goes on, nobody cares, you just need to do your work, the things you care about, and you keep contributing. And so it's kind of become an interesting thing in the sense that the way I now think about open source relative to the business is very pragmatic at the end of the day. We have our investments that we make into open source to the tune of a couple $1 million a year, all going into Solr. We have developers who do nothing but contribute to open source. But of course, we're trying to build and keep the lights on and put the food on the table and all the proverbial cliches around earning money that we have. But interestingly enough, one of the things that you have to think about both as a business, as a community, as a contributor, is how do you create this symbiotic relationship between all of the players in your system? How are we going to make sure this project is sustainable over time? You, in fact, want, just like any community in the real world needs companies coming in, needs contributors, needs volunteers, et cetera, you have to create a space for all players. And this really came home to me because I actually, in my copious spare time, started another open source project called Mahout, or Mahout, depending on which side of the ocean you're on. That was all geared around scalable machine learning. And the interesting thing about that project, it is all volunteers. And it's been all volunteers for a long time. How many of you have heard of Mahout? Exactly. That's kind of the point, right? You've probably heard of Lucene or Solr or Elastic or any of these. What we all need to do when we think about open source is also to think about the sustainability and that symbiotic relationship that you can create between all the different players. And so I would encourage you as you leave today and you think about how you contribute to open source, how you build a company around open source, how your company leverages open source, to think about how you can contribute not just code, not just documentation, those are the easy things, but how do you actually help contribute and make for a sustainable community? And that will then also presumably sustain your company. Thank you very much for your time.